Hey Joe, so thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time, and a big part of Cloud Nirvana is just giving to the community, and we don't worry about kind of what we're going to get back from the community and so forth. And so this is an opportunity for us to highlight, you and your experience. I've got a copy of the book that you've written. It's called "Serverless is a Game Changer: How to Get the Most Out of the Cloud." We're going to talk a bit about that. You're also an upcoming speaker at the Cloud Nirvana conference on March 13th. So we can talk a bit about that as well. So the first thing, though, I just kind of wanted to get to know you a little bit and talk a little bit about kind of what you're doing at Branch. But maybe we'll start from the beginning and just kind of go through your career journey. You've taken, in my mind, a pretty non-traditional kind of an approach to your career, and I find it very fascinating. So maybe just start with from college and how you got into IT and what inspired you to get into tech.
Yeah, no, and thanks for having me on here. I think this is great. I think what you're doing here in the community is great. And like, I have been helped so much along my career with just people gracious with their time. So if I can be helpful, I'm happy to do it. I think actually my journey began in middle school. I really enjoyed working with computers. It was an interesting thing. I first started programming with HyperCard on Macintosh computers. For my 14th birthday, I asked for Turbo Pascal 5 and some books. I really wanted to learn how to write BBS door games. And so I ran a bulletin board actually at the time. I started running it when I was 12, and I wanted to be able to write these games, which were all text-based games. But I also had always felt that I wanted to be a lawyer. And so I reached this interesting moment when I was 14, 15, where I would be going to meet with lawyers in the community and like, can I volunteer? Can I do anything? And law is a very exclusionary profession. You have to pass the bar. It's actually, the bar is run not by the state or anything, but by people, and they get to decide who's in or out. And generally there's a feeling that, you have to go through all this process before you can do anything. And on the other hand, in software development and tech, there was no restriction. I could do whatever I wanted. And so I quickly found that I learned how to program, I wrote shareware, I sold it, and I was working suddenly as a equal participant in the space. And so I went to college, I wrote software in college. I wrote the first program to make the iPod work with Windows in college by reverse engineering the iPod database. I made that a free software. All the while thinking I still wanted to go to be in the law. And so, but even while I was in law school, I was doing things. I went to Yale Law School. I built the system that the Yale Law Journal published things on the internet for the first time in kind of an interactive way, and got involved in those things. But ultimately realized the place for me to be and the place where I was good and helpful and was more social was in tech and in software development. And so I just kept going in software development specifically, along the way being like a Linux systems administrator and a database administrator and trying a bunch of different options. But really software development is what I found the most compelling. And so kind of stumbling through this period from 14 to call it 27, 28, I got a law degree. And then I said, no, I'm a sort of technical co-founder or CTO for life.
Well, I would imagine that it gives you some unique, benefits to having a law degree as well as being a technologist.
It is amazing the benefit of law school on thinking and how to think. I mean, the people who say, it's the best sort of general purpose graduate school, I think might be right. I mean, I haven't been to other ones, but certainly you enter law school without as good an ability to parse problems and break them down into pieces and analyze them individually. And that's the thing that's really helped me in business, in tech, in everything. And I think one phrase that all of my co-founders tell me I say all the time, which is well, let's break this down. We need to break this down into pieces. We've combined too many things here. We need to look at them individually.
Yeah, I agree. But so given your career, journey, and the fact that you're a co-founder at Branch and you've co-founded other companies as well, what inspired you to take this more entrepreneurial track as opposed to, I grew up in the enterprise. After high school, I served in the Navy, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do, I wanted to do something in computers. I was fascinated by video games. Like you, I was, I programmed on the Apple IIe back in the day, the Commodore 64, using BASIC, and I was really fascinated. I spent my summers going to computer camp and things like that. Um, but I've taken a more sort of traditional enterprise route, which that's it's got its own challenges and its own benefits. There's pros and cons and so forth. But I'm really fascinated and interested to hear about your journey on taking a more non-traditional kind of an entrepreneurial route.
It was really, a lot of this was accidental. I started doing software development as an independent software developer writing shareware. That felt natural. And then the first companies I started, the first company I started was when I was a senior in high school, and someone approached me. I wrote shareware. I hired a graphic designer. That graphic designer came to me and said, "Hey, I know someone who's looking for a programmer to start a company." This was 1999. And I was like, great. I mean, I'm in high school. Like I get paid, occasionally to like mow lawns. Like, this is a fantastic way to make money. And more reliably than on the shareware side, where it was like, $10 checks coming in the mail sometimes. And it just kept continuing that way. And even in college, where I took a number of computer science classes, wonderful computer science classes, but I remember in like 2001, I took this class in software engineering. And I had built all this software, right? And I built it for a company that was making money. I built all this shareware, and it was a very waterfall focused development software engineering course where everyone in the class like built something, got specifications. And I remember being in the class saying, continually asking the professor who had worked at, I think, Microsoft in doing, this very waterfall sort of spec-driven development. And I kept saying, this is really inefficient. This is terrible. Like, why are you doing this? Like, and even asking some of the questions that drive, I think, agile development. I mean, not precisely, but sort of saying like, hey, but don't you find like when you build this, like you got to make a bunch of changes immediately? Like I had built this software in 1999 where we released, and we used to joke that like version 1 was giving the users all of the features they asked for, and version 2 was taking all the features away because they couldn't handle the power, and they kept doing things they weren't supposed to do. And so I had this sense that like you couldn't just ask people what they wanted and get a good specification. And so when I looked forward at, build software with entrepreneurs who would come find me. I mean, I've sort of never applied for a job. I mean, people find me and say, hey, you want to start this company with me? And so those were always much more appealing than, my view of like, I would have to go somewhere and implement something that would have been like that software engineering course, which I just felt was, how do you waste the time of 22 people to do something over the course of a semester that one person could have done in 6 weeks, and then you could have started to get feedback from users,
Yeah, I would agree. The thing that kind of comes to my mind is, when I think back on my journey, which, also goes back to the 90s, I think about how the building blocks for building applications has just dramatically changed over time, And you look at the way in which we go about developing today, and the tools that are available, and the tools that are on the horizon as well with generative AI.
Yep.
It's amazing. The actual building blocks are changing. And one of the questions that I had for you, and I'm fairly confident I know where you're going to go with this, was, like how do you personally keep up to date and up to speed in terms of the ever evolving landscape of technology? It's not just the technologies and the applications that we buy off the shelf and so forth. It's the very way in which we go about developing software, the processes that we use, and the mentality that it takes to really adopt, and to your point in the book, this what you call a serverless mindset.
I think and you're absolutely right. It's not just the tech, it's the how, and it's even like how to conceive of building these things. And in the book, I talk about there's no continuing education here. We have this problem, but the whole back quarter of the book is just me listing managed services. And I'm hoping that a lot of people get this book and they're like, well, no matter what I thought about the book, like this last, like whatever it is, 90 pages is like incredibly useful for just, I didn't know these things. And this happens to me repeatedly. I send this list to, CTOs, and they're like, I've sent this to the CTO of Webflow, which I think is a fantastic company. He's like, I didn't know half of these. And like, I'm amazed. And like, I want to use them now. And so, I think it's a really difficult problem. I have found that Twitter, now X, has been a phenomenal place to be challenged about things, and also really doing some consulting, moving around and working with high-end consulting firms. I've had some times where we've hired quite expensive development help, like a ThoughtWorks, Originate, Pivotal Labs, and watching them work with process. Modus Create's another one. Those have been wonderful, and so, but it is a constant quest to go and be challenged and ask, what are new and different ways of doing things. I generally think, if you're not constantly testing things and throwing away like half of the stuff you test, then you're not looking at it enough. There's a lot out there. A lot of it's not what you should do, but unless you build a culture and a focus around testing and not always like test and use, but test and throw away, I think you're in
Right.
it's a big problem.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say that, in my experience, and I think this is just more, a function of human nature, because we get so comfortable with the way in which we do things that we as technologists get so embedded in the tools that we use and so connected to them. It's like we wrap up our entire career and success in our career with the tools that we use. And because technology moves so fast, it's always, looking back in the past and thinking about, well, that, the way in which I'm thinking about this, my paradigm is already out of touch with where the technology is going. And I love what you're saying about, to me, it's about having that right mindset about, embracing change and embracing new technologies and looking for new opportunities. Do you struggle with finding folks at Branch and creating a culture in your organization that really embraces the advancement of technology and adopting new tools, adopting new paradigms?
We don't, but it's like very intentional, because I've seen a lot throughout my career. It's a question of can you get people to commit their identities to getting better, and maybe their identities closest to how to build software successfully for an organization, as opposed to building your identities around knowing a specific technology. I worked with a guy named George Orlov for years, who's great, and he used to say the kiss of death for any company is to have a job like Oracle DBA. It's like, because that person is never going to stop using Oracle. It is
This is true.
you can't, you can't make everyone's job title like business success, person, right? I mean, you've got titles. And so, if you have someone who is a software developer, which, those are our titles, we make it very clear to people that if you find a solution to use and you don't have to write code, you're still very much a software developer. I mean, we're still building things for what we do. We don't celebrate lines of code. I mean, if anything, we celebrate removing lines of code. But we do that as part of our interviews and as part of how we talk about things. I'll give one other example here that I find very meaningful, and we talk about it as it's a cultural artifact. We refuse to name any programs that we write by cute names. We name them very generically. So like our front end for purchasing insurance for consumers is called Quote FE for, getting a quote, and FE is front end. And our internal application that is used by independent agents as well as our team is called staff FE. It's the staff, and it's the front end. And there's often, people often complain. They're like, we need to, look at all these cute names people have. But, as soon as you name it, you can't kill it. And so like it needs to be generic enough so that no one really feels like they have this sense of ownership over it or an endowment effect on it.
Yeah, I would agree. So that's a really, really interesting tactic. If essentially eliminating or trying to eliminate to the extent possible the emotional connection that you have to the applications and the tools.
Yeah,
so yeah.
I'll give one interesting example. Like, and I believe in empowering people, and so recently we have needed to implement more and more complex security. So a lot of like SAML and other kind of SSO type technologies for like independent agencies and for us and those. And, we use Cognito, which is a managed service from Amazon, and you can write some custom code around Cognito to support all these things, but there are other managed services that exist that can help you with this. And the development, I was very pro, like, let's just use Cognito. It'll be simpler and we'll write a bunch of code around it in the functions. That's fine. I think that's still a serverless mindset. But the team really came back and they said, no, we found this vendor. It's called Dscope. It's fabulous. And like, and they really laid out like, this is why. And like, they were basically using my own like philosophies and words, toward me. I mean, they were really living the culture in a way that like, I just didn't want to deal with another vendor in this space. And I worried about uptime because authentication uptime needs to be near perfect. And, they had really done their homework and they did a great job of saying, no, we're not going to build this ourselves. We should do this. So I feel very good about the internal culture and people's willingness to just go find another vendor that does that thing or go use a new tech that does that thing. Don't keep using the stuff we know.
Right. So we're sort of dancing around a bit of a big part of the book that you wrote. So why don't we jump right in? And so here's my question for you. So you take a very unique approach to application development, and in my mind, the architecture, the enterprise architecture at the companies that you at Branch. And instead of writing software, you really look for opportunities to leverage managed services, and then weaving those managed services into your ecosystem using APIs. In fact, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier about culture and decision making and so forth in your book, you talk about how you've got like a decision tree that you kind of go through when you're looking at a particular solution. The first thing you say is, don't build anything. Let's pause. At least not yet. We'll get there. The first thing is, number one, downscope out. Create a culture of downscoping. Number two, buying it off the shelf as SaaS. Number three, if you can't buy SaaS, then use an API. If you can't use an API, then look for open source software. And then only then, when all of those options have been exhausted, do you write code and make sure that code is maintainable.
Absolutely. I love it. Yeah, that's exactly it.
So with that, I guess going back to what you were saying earlier about vendor management and so forth, obviously with this approach, you've got to be really good about the way in which you manage vendors, and very selective in the way in which you decide which solutions are going to fit which business problem.
Yeah, and I think you need this approach is only possible if your organization is built around helping you test, evaluate, and select appropriate vendors. So you have to have a highly functional, very good third-party risk management program. So you've got to have a way to bring a vendor in, do your information security evaluation, do your financial evaluation, do the uptime evaluation, and you got to build that function into your organization. And so I see at least a lot of enterprises where that process is just so painful. I mean, I've seen this a lot on the startup side too, which is like, oh my goodness, we should partner with this other company if for no other reason than they already have a contract with a company. By the way, that's terrible third-party risk management as well, right? I mean, if I have a backdoor way to get into your enterprise by partnering with someone, and that means I get like no security look at me at all, Like, that's terrible. Like, I mean, that's just sort of an obfuscated, lie that enterprise is telling itself. We live in a world in which we need third-party risk management is like one of the biggest places that every company should be making a great process. By the way, there are great vendors in this space. There's one we started using called Visa Trust that will will make the first pass of the security review for you based upon what you need. They'll go ask for all the documents, they'll review it, they'll give you a good summary of the review, and then they'll identify risk for you to lay out. And so there's so much you can do here to make this a great process, but making a bad choice on one of these vendors is a problem. And you need to also identify like how much does it matter, right? I mean, if I'm picking an authentication vendor or a payments vendor, I better have like zero downtime effectively, and I better be able to see that historically and believe it, right? But if I'm picking a vendor that, I don't know, if I like address autocomplete that will like fill in a form, but like if it's not there, you can still use the form, like, I can have a lower standard for that. And organizations need to build that muscle in. And I think organizations where that procurement and third-party risk management is so far from the business and is not compensated based upon business success, those are cases where it's very difficult. And so you have to solve that problem in the organization before you can really achieve this. And by the way, I think that's true about a lot of things in enterprises. It's like the book Accelerate, talking about what are the development metrics that matter. A lot of times you have to just rework the comps, the org structure, the compensation, and everything in the organization if you're actually going to achieve, these better levels of productivity and better business outcomes.
Agree. So, okay, so let me just provide a little bit of context here that I think would be helpful to our listeners, because I want to give people a flavor for what we're talking about here, because all companies at the end of the day use managed services. I would say anybody would agree that
Mm-hmm.
having a strong third-party risk management program, being able to manage vendors and so forth, of course that's important in any company. But here's a little bit of context, and we'll jump back in. So I've been in the insurance industry now for 8 years, and my entire career has been in financial services. I've grown to love the insurance industry. I think it's a very noble industry. I can't even imagine what society would look like without insurance. It would be a big problem. So thank you for bringing your skills and your leadership to this noble industry. Here's the thing. If you want to have an insurance company, you really have to have three things. You have to have a policy admin system, you have to have a billing system, and you have to have a claim system. Now, normally, carriers will go out and they'll purchase a big software product, from Duck Creek or Guidewire or Majesco, you name it. You've taken a very, very different approach. And I would say your approach to, at least the word that I use, and maybe you disagree with this, is this highly distributed, almost, the other term that comes to my mind is microservices, using systems that are good for what they are good at, weaving them into your ecosystem via APIs. The idea is that with all those systems that you've integrated, the sum is much greater than the individual, whole of, individual parts. I didn't say that very well, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, it's great. And it's useful to say, like, we use Snapsheet for our claim system. So like we bought that because we didn't want to do claims in any kind of differentiated way. Now you could talk to our claims team about, well, we wish Snapsheet did all these things. And so, we work with our vendor on that. But when it came to policy admin and to billing, we wanted to do something different in the space, which was to enable you to buy home and auto, to get a bindable price with home and auto with just name and address, like 90% of the time, and to be able to buy that in like a minute if you wanted to. And most people buy it in like 5 to 10 minutes. But most insurance companies in the industry will take you more than an hour to buy home and auto insurance. And you can buy umbrella in there right there. We're about to launch life in there in like another minute. You can buy life. So, a bunch of these products that just trying to make it much easier to buy. And so we found that we couldn't do that with any of the existing software packages. We also found that ultimately we would be buying the existing software packages largely for their data structures and then APIs that we didn't like. And then we would have had to build all the interfaces on top of them. And we would have still spent an enormous amount of money for those systems. We also didn't like that a lot of those systems really require that you bring a lot of systems integrators on site, and then they have to like live with you for like a year or more to set it up for you.
And they're so expensive.
Yeah. And so all of those things when we were young, we said we have to figure out how to build this ourselves. And so you're right that the best way to think of our system is like we use DynamoDB as our core database in Amazon. That's a wonderful managed database. It's more of a key value store than it is a relational database. We actually ship all that data using a service called Fivetran to BigQuery, which is our data lake where we do all of our analytics out of Google Cloud. So we have this multi-cloud strategy for what's great because BigQuery is just better than Athena or Redshift at Amazon. And so everywhere we've asked, like, how do we leverage a really great managed service to handle things? We use Stripe for our billing. Stripe's a phenomenal partner for us in being able to handle billing. So they will store the cards. We tell them how much to bill, though. We don't use any of their sort of subscription products. And so we tie all these together. We have custom code, custom front end. But one of the things that's interesting, and I'm glad you brought up the microservices question, is that in traditional architectures that use virtual machines or containers, the microservices versus monolith discussion has meaning in a way that in our architecture it doesn't. And so let me explain. So a microservices versus monolithic architecture, when you're deploying it yourself in containers or VMs, really asks like, is the application unit you're deploying, like there's kind of one application and kind of one database server, and they're going to interact with each other. That's a monolithic deployment. And a microservices deployment is more like, usually the Netflix definition of microservices, every microservice is going to have its own data store. It could be a queue or something, but basically they're all like a bunch of independent applications. And I think we've seen people really go overboard with this. And if you have thousands of microservices for an application, probably it's not maintainable. And maintainability is the thing that we care the most about at Branch. In our architecture, it looks quite microservice-y. It's like, oh, we're using this managed service here and this managed service here, and we've got this little code that connects them right over here. And we've got this front end that's run on a managed service called Vercel that hosts the front end. But if you look more, like if I think about it, I would tell you it's a monolithic architecture. We deploy it monolithically. It's in one repository. So even our mobile app, which is available for Android and iOS, it's all one repository. There's one code repository at Branch where all this code sits. You can deploy things individually, but most of the time people just deploy the whole thing. And so the microservices monolith traditional debate to me just doesn't kind of apply. And I view this new world that I see it as a new world that we live in is more like there are all these services out there. They're run by teams that are amazing. They basically don't go down, or to the extent they go down, they have great failover and great recovery, and you kind of don't need to worry about them. And so it's a little like you have all of these teams. Like we have the Amazon DynamoDB team, like they're they're a Branch employee because they're running this database. It's well documented. They follow their SLAs, and we get to use them. And so we have all of these things that we get to run, and we have these relationships. We can call them up and talk to them. But in the end, we only pay for them for what we use of them. And so this then sort of odd monolith that we deploy, that's a bunch of things stitched together that are just sort of generally online on the internet all the time, makes it so fast and easy for us to build things. And for some people, it would terrify them. I mean, there are people who look at our architecture and have looked at these architectures that I've built. I've built applications with these architectures for about 10 years now. And people look at them and they go, that's terrible. You're going to have terrible uptime. And all I can tell you is for the last 10 years, I've had fabulous uptime, but not control over it. I've just had trust,
You talk a lot in your book about the importance of interfaces. And I wonder if you talk a bit about your philosophy around interfaces, because tell me if I'm wrong, but when you're in a microservices based kind of an architecture, you decide that you need to pivot. Maybe you chose a managed service that at the end of the day, they couldn't keep up with what they had indicated they could, and so you decided you have to pivot. I would assume that it's having those services loosely coupled into your architecture using services is one of the techniques that you use to give you agility and flexibility so that you can pivot when necessary. Is that
That's
true?
absolutely correct. And so, one of the tactics that we have, so we use TypeScript mostly, some JavaScript, but TypeScript, JavaScript on the front end and the back end. And we have shared packages between the two. So we generally can write kind of one piece of code and then use it in the front of the back end, which is incredibly, and also in the mobile app, which is also written in JavaScript. And so all of that means that we're not repeating logic. We can reuse code in lots of places. And it means that every time we pick a service to interface with, whether it's one of our own or something else, or a third-party service, we write a package around that. And so we will have a package, like we use Front for customer support. So we didn't write our own customer support system. It's like a Zendesk competitor. Or we use Stripe. We use ChargeDesk as another billing service. We use all these services. Every time we interact with one of these services, we have a package, TypeScript package that defines all the interfaces, that defines all the calls and everything. And when we swap these out, you just change that. And it's very easy. We switch services out all the time. We started with Zendesk, now we're with Front. We've used 4 different referral services to handle customers referring their friends to Branch. So we're constant. We've used 3 different phone systems. We constantly changing the systems we use, and in general, it's not hard to switch these out. I mean, the main thing that makes it hard to change what you're using is when you have just a ton of code that all has these baked in assumptions to it that you're always going to keep using that code. And so the problem is when for example, if you have code that interacts with a database and has an assumption that this data is always going to be in this database in this way, and that's repeated everywhere throughout this code base, it's like millions of lines of code. That's impossible to pull out. But if you started interacting with some managed service for this thing, then you already had to build interfaces to it. And so switching that out or even bringing that in-house, and we've done this. We've used a third-party service and then we've decided we want to write it ourselves because it doesn't do it as well. That's really easy because then you've already got this interface you use. We actually use this service called airplane.dev that's shutting down on March 1st. And they built all these great sort of ways of thinking about how to build internal tools is how it's set up. It's sort of RPA type, a remote robotic process automation type stuff. So those interfaces just existed. We just brought them in-house and re-implemented the airplane stuff that we needed in our own code. And it will take us about 6 weeks to rewrite the core parts of this, 2 developers, 6 weeks. And then we won't pay them, the whatever $60,000 a year we used to pay.
Right. That is really amazing. I am curious in your, organizationally, how do you govern these decisions? You need to make a technology decision. And, as I'm sure, everybody can appreciate, there's always lots and lots of options to consider. When you find something that you feel is a good fit, you start weaving it into your ecosystem, you start using it. And then maybe sometime down the road, that company pivots or whatever, you decide you want to go into a different direction. Do you have a team that at Branch that is looking over the ecosystem sort of strategically, like maybe an enterprise architecture team, or are all the individual teams, sort of empowered to make those recommendations and decisions?
Yeah, it's all about empowering the individuals, and it's useful to note that we don't even have distinctions at Branch between front end developer, back end developer, API developer. We just have developer. Because everything's in the same language, because everything's in the same repository. We generally hire front end developers, although I think about half, maybe more than half of the developers at Branch, we were the first software development job they had. And we've run a boot camp. And so we have a number of developers who are in the boot camp. They took our boot camp and then we hired them straight into an internship. And so this, generally speaking, every developer can work on any part of the code base. So that's the general structure is very fungible, talent that can kind of go anywhere. And then we have a very strict process around our business units are what bring us the business problems we need to solve. So we don't have a typical product manager model being in a financial service and in insurance. We have departments who are stakeholders. We have a wonderful product management team whose job it is to elicit the business problem to solve from the department. And then all of our departments, we set the expectation with them that you get to define the problem, but the product management team with the design team and with the software development team are going to figure out this downscoped V1 solution. And then we're going to measure it and we're going to see how we're doing, and then we're going to go. And so now the business stakeholders can, when they see a proposal, can say, well, it won't work. And so we'll come up with a design. And we do like pixel perfect designs ahead of time. We like fully specify the thing ahead of time so that when it gets to the developer can just build. And everything is designed to be as small as downscoped as possible. So like, we really don't have anything that would like about 6 weeks would be the absolute longest project, but most things are like, a couple days.
Right. So clearly culture is very, very
Critical.
important to Branch, which also means that leadership is also very, very important to Branch. When you're hiring new associates and you're hiring folks into leadership positions, or, I take the philosophy that, regardless of what your job is, whether you're managing people or not, everybody has a leadership role to play. What are the leadership traits, or what are the traits that you look for, to make sure you're bringing people in that have the right leadership skills, the right cultural fit, et cetera?
Yeah, we use the Arbinger Institute programs. I don't know if you're familiar with those. They have a book called Leadership and Self-Deception. And then later they've gone and they've kind of renamed it a bit called the Outward Mindset. I would tell you that, my experience with most of these kind of management training courses and kind of manager training is that they tend to be very gimmicky, right? They tend to be like, take this survey, and then we'll tell you whether you're INTJ or you're a magician or you're a hobbit. And then if you're a hobbit who has to talk to a magician, like, here's how you talk to it. And I've just done a million of these things. They're so reductive and they're kind of insulting, right? They don't feel like you're treating like an adult. They feel like you're treating like a child. And they ultimately aren't that helpful, I think, in the end. Like, depending on when I take Myers-Briggs, I'm either INTJ or ENTJ. Like, I mean, literally based on a couple of questions different. Like, I'm on that line because I can be extroverted in some cases, introverted in others. But I also know that's helpful. Is it helpful to know how to work with me and manage me, to know if I'm introverted or extroverted? Like, maybe like in this classification. So the best thing about leadership and self-deception and the Arbinger Institute view is that it's actually a pretty simple message, which is treat people like people, not like objects. And that sounds simple, and most people think they do that already. So the actual hard part of the Arbinger training is like recognizing how everybody fails at this and recognizing how to be better at it. I would highly recommend Leadership and Self-Deception to anyone. I listened to it as an Audible book. I wanted to throw my phone out the car or off my bike like many times when I was listening to it initially. So the only thing I can say is stick with it. I think it's an incredibly useful way of thinking about how we can be better or worse people. And so when you ask about, when we hire, we generally are looking for people who are going to treat people like people, not like objects, people who are going to find satisfaction in helping and leading people and not in their own status. And we're not perfect at it. And, I would say the most challenging conversations we have with leaders are when leaders are obsessed with how many people they're managing, right? Or their orbit of power, but from the very top, like Steve Lekis, our CEO, sets an amazing example of being kind and empathetic and really selfless in a good way. I think you can be selfless in a bad way. And we all try to do it. We all try to hold each other accountable to it. And we have, I would say most of the senior people who have left, who we have parted ways with because of cultural, because they didn't live into this culture in the way that we needed them to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So let's jump into the Cloud Nirvana conference. It's coming up March 13th. Our focus is going to be on hybrid and multi-cloud strategy. And you take a very unique approach. I wouldn't say unique, but a very specific approach to the way in which you go about doing multi-cloud and hybrid cloud. And your talk is why I'll never go hybrid again.
Yeah.
So the thing I love about it is that tells me you've got some in the trenches experience that you bring into the community that you want everybody to understand. So can we talk a little bit about what you plan to talk about at the Cloud Nirvana conference and your disdain for hybrid architectures?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think definitionally, I think about multi-cloud is I'm using multiple clouds, and hybrid cloud is I'm going to be able to move an application, either run one application across two clouds at the same time, or build an application so I can move it between clouds. And certainly the original hybrid cloud was I'm going to run some of it on premises, I'm going to run some of it in the public cloud, which we did. So I started a company called BuildFax, and we ran an OpenStack, a first cloud stack, then OpenStack on premises. And then we ran an Amazon Web Services, and you could fail back and forth between them. And it would run between, it would sort of send workloads back and forth based upon different things, and it worked fine. It's, we made it happen and we built it. And so I have that experience. I would say today, I think of hybrid cloud is I'm going to treat the cloud as a lowest common denominator. And multi-cloud is I'm going to treat the cloud for the highest value I can get out of it. And I think just if you zoom out and you ask, what am I going to get the best business value if I'm using managed services, but I'm only using the lowest common denominator across multiple services? Or am I going to get the most value if I'm going to each cloud and using what its absolute best, highest value is, regardless of whether that same capability is available on another cloud? And the answer is like the latter. The multi-cloud is going to be way better for your business. And the hybrid cloud is going to be painfully bad, and is going to necessarily depress what value you can get out of your vendors. And so you have to ask why. Why are you doing that? Why are you purposefully, it would be a little like, I guess it would be a little like, going on a honeymoon to Paris and only eating at McDonald's. I mean, that's great. There's McDonald's everywhere. You know what's there. You feel very comfortable at that. But like, why go to Paris?
Yeah. Man, great point. I guess so. When I think about it from an enterprise perspective, the counter would be that most enterprises have, hundreds of applications in the ecosystem that have, been, modified over the course of decades. And so I guess my first question, just a clarifying point, is when you think about hybrid architecture, are you the granularity that you're thinking of, is it by application, or are you, is Branch fully in the cloud and all managed services, all software as a service, all function as a service, et cetera, and you don't have, your own data center that you manage for anything?
Yeah, so Branch is fully in the cloud. At Branch, we actually have no private networks. Everything is identity is the perimeter.
Wow.
It's all single sign-on, and every, even our office intranet is like an untrusted internet. There's basically no like VPN. There's sort of an asterisk there for some side stuff, but as with anything in IT, there's always like an asterisk. But in general, we're all fully in the cloud. We've always been fully in the cloud. We've never owned a server.
So that's interesting. So what do you say for enterprises that have a significant investment in applications that are running on the cloud? And like when you look at cloud from a cost perspective, I mean, a lot of the homegrown apps that you can purchase off the shelf that we have running in data centers around the globe, they're not all well suited to run in cloud. From a cost perspective.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. And if we had it on premises hardware, like the few cases that we actually run, we use like AWS workspaces to run like, we've got people who want to run Excel with, like 128 gigs of memory or something, right? And so like we stand up a workspaces, and that if we own the
Right.
hardware, like we would be cheaper to run that on premises. There's no reason not to run that on premises. So I'm not sort of anti on premises, although I will say that I will tell you our security is so much better for being fully zero trust, no internal network. So it is something that I would, generally speaking, want to aspire to. It just makes things so much better. But um, I'm not. I mean, I think like platform engineering within companies is great and is absolutely necessary. A certain number of software developers building things, like you have to have. How are you going to provide like that Google SRE level commitment to the organization and to your developers? You can't assume that all of your developers are going to know how to build this thing with great uptime, especially if they have to work within these applications that are fundamentally, whatever it is, Java or things that, it really don't fit into a serverless model. Also, you can't lift and shift to serverless. You have to re-architect. And so if you've got legacy
Totally agree.
applications, you got to keep running them the way you're running them. My objection to hybrid cloud here is this very specific thing where I would say, if you're going to do platform engineering, you are much better off picking and saying, we're going to go run, like, here are workloads we're going to go run on Amazon Web Services. And we've got our Amazon Web Services platform. And here are all the rules and the designation of this. Here are all the benefits you get out of it. And then if you said we're going to have on-premises Kubernetes or whatever it is, that's a different platform. And you're not going to go tell people we've got one platform and we'll just dynamically pick where you run this stuff. That's the thing that kills you. And you will die on that. I mean, you will die on that hill. You're just a lot better off acknowledging that you should flow through the benefits and the downsides and the interfaces from the specific places that you're running things. And so, for example, like ECS is a very good service. So if I were in charge of a platform team that had Kubernetes internally and was like, we have to do Kubernetes internally, I would 100% not try to extend that same platform and that same way of working. I would establish another platform, and I would go and I would hook people up with ECS. I would make the right security rules and the right other rules, and I would tell them use ECS. I mean, if that didn't work, or maybe it's Google Cloud Run. Google Cloud Run is an amazing product. Maybe it's even something like Railway or Fly.io. Those are great services too. I would just not, like, I've talked with many CTOs and CIOs who have this comment that's something like, we are worried that, I mean, I talked with a C-level executive at a top 10 insurance company who said, we must build this Kubernetes thing that spans multiple clouds that I can sort of dynamically move the workload at the press of a button, because Amazon Web Services might decide tomorrow that it's not okay to run
Right.
us, a top 10 insurance company, because we rate people's auto insurance using their credit scores. And maybe that's not allowed anymore. It just felt like that's a wild risk to have elevated to, I'm going to make a much worse architecture that's going to cost a lot more money and cause my company like actual observable business harm right now for this thing that has never happened and is very unlikely to happen. And so that's the hybrid cloud problem that I see. And I think these CIOs and CTOs who are approaching this the right way are looking at it like, I've got these legacy applications. I want to move people to the cloud. I'm running stuff on-prem. I'm never going to fully get off on-prem. And I think that's fine. I hate these knife edge cutovers. I hate all of these things that are like, we've got a project and we're going to bonus everyone when we turn off the last server. Why? There's always going to be a couple things that like 10 people use. You can run those servers forever. They go down. It's okay. Like, no, move most of the stuff. Like, get comfortable with this kind of pragmatic world. But if you're like, we want to move people to the cloud, we want to encourage our developers to move to the cloud, why enforce like we're going to build a single pane of glass for everything? That's the thing that when we built it was so painful for us. All of the torturous things we had to do so that like OpenStack and Amazon Web Services could play correctly through right scale, 95% of all of our pain was just trying to have these two systems that were clearly different under the hood operate kind of the same way, and it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah. And I, the way I think of it is these decisions that we make on a regular basis, they're all informed by these stories that we tell ourselves about the worst case scenario that, likely is never going to come to fruition. And to your point, even if some of these worst case scenarios do sort of even inch towards coming to the conclusion, there are techniques you can use to mitigate that risk. Things like, relying on interfaces and so forth. I will say your book has a whole section in there around how enterprises can adopt a serverless mindset and how you can start making progress towards moving towards serverless. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And Liberty Mutual actually, as a large insurance carrier, it does a ton of serverless, and they have been steadily on a serverless migration of services for probably 9 years now. Capital One also very focused on doing this, and I think the more everybody gets comfortable with, we're not saying all this stuff is bad and all this new stuff is good and we need to get all the bad to the good. Like, and so many people have that mentality. We need to rewrite all the thing in the new hotness. And you should be much more pragmatic about, where are you going to get the right best business value out of it? But, the bury your head in the sand, like, let's tell ourselves this story that this new thing is dangerous and bad, or there's like a lock-in, oh no, we'll have lock-in, I always, right. Whenever somebody says that, it's rare, but I still run into people who occasionally are like, well, I wouldn't go to the cloud, you get locked in. And I was like, how do you feel about being locked into your electricity provider? You're locked into all sorts of things. Like, it's a weird, arbitrary thing. I'll tell one anecdote. I built a company, got acquired in, and became the CIO of a company with 1,200 employees. And basically, as soon as I started, we ran some security scans on the servers at a co-location facility, and we found that they used VMware. They had a bunch of named servers and named VMs, and they had been penetrated. There was an intruder in the production environment, and there was no great way to understand how to get that person off. And so we moved everything from these VMware VMs to Amazon Web Services over Labor Day weekend. And we moved, basically 90% of 28 virtual machines and 10 petabytes of data. And we didn't even use the truck or anything, we just did a lot of simultaneous uploads. We had a good link to the internet. But it's not, at least I haven't found this, like the lock-in concept to me, it seems, now look, I've been audited by Oracle, I've been audited by VMware. Those were very unpleasant. And those are companies I don't like to do business with because of that. But I've been working with Amazon Web Services since 2008. It's just not in their nature to have those same business practices of trying to extract as much money as they can out of you. They're very public. Their data egress is expensive, and so you got to get comfortable with it. But other than that, you kind of know what things cost, and they'll help you move off them. Stripe's the same way. If you don't like Stripe, they'll export all the cards to some other service. Like most younger technology companies and managed service companies and all these cloud companies generally treat you pretty well. And so I think a lot of the stories around lock-in are just not updated for recent facts.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think to your point, people don't realize that there are techniques that you can use to mitigate that risk.
Yep.
You've got a whole section in the book that also talks about, software development and software deploys and moving towards a more agile mindset where, if you're doing regular deploys, one of the fears to doing more regular deploys is that you might introduce defects into production more often. But the way that you resolve that is by doing more deploys.
Exactly.
And being really good at fixing defects in production and not letting that fear guide your thinking.
The most amazing thing about doing deploys all the time is what you find is that when there is a bug found in production, a lot of times it got into production 4 deploys ago. You realize this stuff is just, if you have good automated testing, reasonably good code review, you use the good continuous integration practices that we know how to do, frequent deploys are the best way to limit bugs because the scope of the deploy is so small.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. I think we're at a point where we can start wrapping up. I want to be very, respectful of your time. We've
Sure.
been going here for about an hour. If you don't mind, I wanted to maybe just talk a little bit about you personally. I want you to know that I really appreciate you being on the podcast with me. Appreciate everything you're doing for the community, sharing your perspective, getting out, and talking with folks, writing this great book. And by the way, everybody, just so you know, serverless is a game changer. It's on shelves today. You can go to Amazon and get yourself a copy. It really is a fantastic book.
Thank you.
I just was curious, from a like a personal perspective, on a day by day basis, what does a day in the life of Joe Emison look like? Like, are you an early riser? Are you a gym guy? Do you allocate time every day to, sharpening the saw, so to speak? And so forth. I'm just curious if there are, if there's any advice that you can give to the community about, other folks that want to aspire to being a CTO at a startup like Branch Insurance.
Yeah, I don't know if any. I do think it's like you find the thing that like works for you and is sustainable for you. My co-founder at Branch, Steve Lekis, has a very different overall sort of approach that works really well for him. I go to the gym 3 times a week. I strongly believe in weight training, especially over 40. I think it's a critical thing. I play tennis, usually 2 or 3 times a week. And I play ultimate frisbee spring and summer. Columbus has a great ultimate league. I run in a bunch of races.
Very cool.
Too. And so I think all of those are critical. I have 3 kids, wife, 3 dogs, a cat, and spend a lot of time with them. So usually in the morning, I'm like getting my kids up. Sometimes I'll go to the gym and come back before they, are headed off to school. I still get to walk my youngest to school every day. She goes to school about 3 blocks away, so she's in 4th grade. So I get to walk her every day, and my 14-year-old son who goes to the middle school that's like across the street. This is great, really walkable. Columbus is wonderfully walkable in places. But I don't suffer any context switching penalty, which is, I think, like really rare based on other people that I've talked to. And so I can go from doing one thing to doing something completely different a second later. And so I tend to not structure my days into like big blocks. I mean, I'm generally in a lot of meetings, but I'm also generally trying to allocate 70% of my time every week to the most important thing that Branch needs me to do that week. And I've had all parts of Branch report to me, and this is also true at other companies I've started. I've had, HR report to me. I've had, sales, always like, software dev, internal IT, data, analytics, etc. I think that also a strong believer in like 8 hours of sleep a night as a really important thing. And I also think cooking your own food is great. I actually worked as a cook for a camp for a number of years, and so I cook dinner for the family, I think, most nights of the week.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've got to pause myself, because I feel if I jump into this conversation with you about fitness and nutrition and lifestyle and things like that, we'll probably be here for another hour. So maybe we'll save that for another podcast. I'm really appreciative of your time today. Thank you so much, Joe, for sharing this with our community. We're really looking forward to seeing you at the Cloud Nirvana conference.
No, thanks. Thanks for having me.